Welcome to the world of scale modeling with Mike Ashey, where techniques, tips, and creativity come alive with dozens of tutorials, projects, tape-up reviews, and picture references to help you build better scale models and enjoy our wonderful hobby. Welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series on building and detailing the Trumpeter 1 to 3/50th scale USS North Carolina. In part 2, we're going to concentrate on building the superstructure and then working on the guns. Many of the delicate and small parts in this kit have excessively large attachment trees, which results in some marring of the surfaces of the parts. To reduce the surface marring, use plastic snippers. Drops of super glue can then be applied to the snipped areas and sanded smooth with a wet sanding stick. The forward superstructure assembly is complete, and it is getting a fit check on the 01 deck level indentation. There are a lot of seams on the forward superstructure assembly. All of them require several applications of superglue to fill the voids. These seams will not be noticeable once the armored tower is attached, so they don't need to be worked on. These seams on the forward area need very careful and extremely light scraping with the number 11 X-Acto blade held at about a 45-degree angle because they're just about impossible to sand smooth. All the seams have been scraped and sanded smooth, and now it's time to fix some of the other issues with this assembly. The tiny seams on both sides of the gun director tub were checked with silver paint, and then the paint was completely removed so that primer and surface colors would not be pulled off during the masking process. There are a series of portholes that are out of scale on both sides of the forward superstructure. Drill them out with a .052 inch drill bit and then superglue .05 inch rod into place. Plastic rod was snipped and cut flush with the surface and then sanded smooth and checked with silver paint. Note the seam line that is hidden with sections of half-round plastic strips. Tiny pencil lines were measured and drawn across the surface of the filled portholes. New porthole locations were then marked and drilled out. After the superstructure sides were glued onto their respective box shapes, several coats of superglue were applied to the perimeter seams and then carefully and lightly scraped flat with the tip of a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade held at about a 45-degree angle. Some seams were also on the sides of the superstructure parts. Careful scraping and sanding is required so that you don't distort the vertical edges. This seam, which is on both sides of this assembly, was carefully scraped with a number 11 X-Acto blade and then sanded smooth with a small sanding stick. The forward superstructure tower is a real challenge to build. Tape it together lightly, position it onto the deck to help set the shape, and then apply tiny drops of superglue to the inside top area to secure the parts in place. The smokestacks are also a multi-piece assembly, and the parts don't quite fit together very well. Here again, superglue was first applied to the inside seam areas. More superglue was applied along the inside and outside seam lines of the superstructure tower. The seams were then carefully scraped and sanded smooth with a wet sanding stick. The bases and tops of both smokestacks needed to be flattened so that the assemblies would sit straight and the top pieces will be positioned correctly. The forward superstructure part on each smokestack was also a poor fit, requiring lots of superglue to fill the voids. The curved surfaces were reshaped with various grades of sandpaper and a flexifile. Many of the perimeter seams on the superstructure subassemblies were difficult to fix without damaging or distorting the edges or surfaces, so I decided to hide them with .03 inch half and quarter round strips. All the superstructure subassemblies are now complete and they've been primed. Once they are painted, they can be further assembled into their respective locations. The upper and lower hull sections were tightly taped together and superglue was applied along the seam lines and then sanded smooth. The lamp risers were then glued into place. The aft superstructure was attached to the O1 level to make it easier to paint. Note the .03-inch half-round sections applied to the superstructure assembly to hide the seams. All the superstructure sub-assemblies got several fit checks throughout their individual construction. Here, one final fit check is necessary to be sure there are no fit problems. The deck chocks and bits were attached using tiny drops of superglue applied with the thin wire applicator. The entire hull and deck assembly was primed and checked closely for any flaws. The rescribed deck planking was very noticeable on the aft deck area. The scribing needle cut too deep into the plastic. The forward deck area rescribed planking was also very noticeable. To reduce the depth of the rescribed lines, the surfaces were lightly wet sanded with 600 grit sandpaper and then smoothed out with 0000 steel wool pads. Before attaching the 20mm gun shields to the forward part of the deck, the surface was polished with .0000 steel wool pads to remove the primer. The forward 20mm shields were positioned and tiny drops of superglue were applied on the ends and middle sections to set these fragile kit parts in place. A bead of superglue was then applied to the base on both sides of each shield. The 20mm shields and the 40mm gun tubs were attached along the forward port and starboard areas. Some of the 20mm shields needed some careful cleanup work prior to gluing them into place. The aft 20mm shields seemed to be a bit thicker and not so fragile, so they were easier to handle and glue into place. The hull and deck assembly has been reprimed and is now complete, and now it's time to turn my attention to the guns. Note how big the pine board is that the model is attached to. An oversized board helps prevent damage to the subassembly. I replaced the kit's 16-inch gun barrels with those from a Tamiya, Missouri. The barrels were carefully and lightly scraped to remove the seam lines, holding the blade at about a 45-degree angle. Be very careful not to distort the shape of the barrel. To polish the surface of the barrels and restore the round shape, 0000 steel wool pads were wrapped around each barrel and the plastic was rotated inside the pads. The barrel tips were hollowed out using various sizes of drill bits. Use a pin vise to center punch an indentation in the tip of each barrel, and then use the smallest drill bit for the first hole, and then gradually, progressively use larger bits. The 16-inch turrets have separate sides that have fit challenges along the top and the front. A lot of superglue was applied along the seam lines to fill these voids. The turret tops and fronts were wet sanded to smooth out the superglue. This destroys the surface detail, but some of it will be restored. The seam lines were checked with silver paint and additional superglue was applied in the needed areas. The sanding and finishing process was then repeated until the seams disappeared. Small sections of plastic were glued to the backside of the gun openings. The guns had rods set in their bases along with corresponding holes in the turret face so that each barrel would have a strong, positive attachment. The locations of the turret vents were marked, holes drilled, and then .035-inch round stock was cut and glued into place. The optical range finders were added, the turrets were primed, and then the photo etch ladders were added. The kit's 5-inch turrets were replaced with cast resin ones from Voyager models. The castings were easy to clean up and beautifully cast. The brass barrels have stems to set them correctly and indentations in the tips of the barrels. To set the position of the barrels in the turrets, I made a gauge from .015-inch by .040-inch sheeting and with a .0225 hole. I used a pin vise to indent the surfaces on the turret and then used a .0225-inch bit to drill the barrel holes. To set the turrets correctly on the deck, I drilled a .082-inch hole into the bottom of each turret and added short lengths of .080-inch plastic rod. This diameter rod almost matched the diameter of the round holes in the deck. The brass barrels were first set with white glue so they could be adjusted, and then they were secured with tiny drops of super glue. The barrels need to be straight, and both barrels on each turret need to be positioned at the same angle. The turrets were primed to check for surface flaws. These castings were flawless, with no surface bubbles or voids. I had several sets, and all of them had flawless castings. These 5-inch turrets were 3D printed, and they're from BlackCat Models. The surface detail on these turrets is just incredible, and I would have used them had 3D printed parts been available when I built this kit. The 3D printed runners on these turrets are very tiny and easy to cut off. The parts are just absolutely superb in their surface detail. The 3D printed runners for the barrels are attached to the base, so it's very easy to remove them with absolutely no cleanup along the barrel's length, and the ends of the barrels are indented. The Gold Metal Models Photo Etch Detail Set for this kit comes with 40mm shields, and they are easy to shape and install. I slightly pre-bent the shields along the bend lines as a first step. The Photo Etch Detail Set also comes with a gauge for setting the correct angles of the shields. I glued the gauge to a 0.04-inch thick piece of plastic and trimmed it to the gauge's shape. Each shield was then folded around the gauge. For the quad 40mm assemblies, remove the mold lines on the guns, clean up the bases, and then glue on the guns. Attach the gun sights and the aft railings. The shields were then bent and attached to the bases with superglue. To help the assembly of each 40mm gun platform, attach the gun platform to a piece of balsa wood with double folded tape so the assembly will not move as you work with it. All the 40mm guns are now completely assembled and they're ready to be primed. The gun shields were glued at the lower front end first, and then the back sides where the edges touch the rear of the gun platform. These 3D printed 40mm gun platforms are from BlackCat Models. And here again, just like with the 5-inch turrets, the surface detail is absolutely superb. The print runners are tiny and very easy to cut off from the parts with no distortion whatsoever. The surface detail on these 40mm guns is just about impossible to achieve with photo etch detail parts. The 3D printed 40mm guns are also superbly detailed. BlackCat Models has two versions of their 40mm quad platforms. This version with separate photo etch shields, and they make another version that has the 3D printed shields attached directly to the platforms. BlackCat Models 40mm guns also come with the directors, which are again superbly detailed, and it would be impossible to achieve this level of detail with a photo etch detail set. To aid in the positioning and attaching the photo etch shields to the Trumpeter 20mm guns, make a jig. The height of the front vertical face of the jig should be 4/32 of an inch high, and the angle should be approximately 70 degrees. I also recommend making a 20mm gun holder so the assemblies will be positioned upright while drying. This holder can also be used as an airbrush platform for the completed guns. BlackCat Models also makes a set of 3D printed 20mm guns. The surface detail on these parts is just exquisite and impossible to achieve with photo etch parts no matter how careful you are. I replaced the kit's whaleboats with Tamiya, Missouri whaleboats and used the Gold Metal Models detail sets which fit perfectly on these parts. BlackCat Models also makes 3D printed whaleboats, and I highly recommend them as a replacement for the kit parts. The kit's 36-inch searchlights were hollow on the backside, so I covered them with small 0.015-inch discs punched out with the Waldron punch tool. Here are the BlackCat Models 36-inch searchlights, and I highly recommend them to replace them for the kit parts. BlackCat Models also makes 24-inch searchlights, and here again they are superbly detailed. When I built my second Tamiya 1:350th scale USS Missouri, I used all of the BlackCat Models 3D printed parts that were available at the time to build this kit, and what a difference it made in the appearance of the model. Stay tuned for part 3, where I use the Gold Medal Models photo etch set to really enhance the appearance of the Trumpeter 1 to 3/50th scale USS North Carolina. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. And when you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeashey.com, where you're going to find dozens of free PDF downloads, including tutorials, picture references, model galleries, projects, and my 5 original scale modeling books. Thanks to Ben Sound and Videvo for the royalty-free music, and happy scale modeling!